Jumping the gun, an Italian news outlet leaks a draft version of a papal teaching on the environment. Confirmed kill. Al-Qaeda's #2 leader targeted by U.S. airstrikes is reported dead. Kids to Capitol Hill. Children with serious health issues lobby Congress for help getting treatment. And feeding the hungry. In the heart of our nation's capital, the poor don't have enough to eat. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, June 16th, 2015. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Well, they couldn't wait until Thursday. An Italian news weekly leaks the full text of the Pope's encyclical on the environment. The Vatican asked the media to respect a Thursday embargo for the release of Laudato Si, or Be Praised. The press credentials of a veteran Italian columnist are suspended indefinitely. He says his editor did it. The Vatican said it was just a draft that was released, but media all over the world ran with it today. We are not reporting the details of this important papal teaching until it is officially released on Thursday. We do welcome back Dr. Chad Pecknold, theology professor at Catholic University of America. So how do you think Catholics should approach Laudato Si?
I think with a spirit of willingness to learn from the Holy Father. This is a teaching document, and whether or not we agree or disagree with aspects of climate change, we shouldn't come to the encyclical with that framework. We should come with a spirit of receptivity. We're about to hear the voice of Peter.
It's 192 pages long. That's a little tedious.
It's a lot of Peter.
It's a lot of Peter. So what kind of weight does a papal encyclical hold in terms of church teaching?
Sure, it's a contribution to the ordinary magisterium, which continually teaches the universal truths of the faith and the morals. There will be different levels of weight within an encyclical, but of greater weight to truths of the faith than, say, truths about climate change. But the encyclical itself is the highest form of papal authority in the Church.
So this issue of climate change, the environment, has, as we talked about last time, has been sort of labeled liberal. Why do you think conservatives should be drawn to this document?
Well, I think it's in the word conservative. A conservative should be a conserver. And Pope Francis has put out an encyclical that we all should be receptive to this question of not what environment means to progressives, but what does the object mean? What is the common home to which it refers? And that's a common home that conservatives ought to want to care for, to conserve, to protect.
This issue is so politicized, really sharply dividing. What do you think this document will do for this debate?
I think it pushes past the politics of climate change to the realities to which they refer, realities that maybe would disagree on scientific theories, but none of us will disagree with the fact that this common earth is something that we all share, we want to protect, we want to conserve it, we want to pass it on to our kids and our grandkids.
Already a lot of discussion, and I'm sure more to come. Dr. Chad Pecknold, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Pope Francis follows centuries of church tradition, writing a formal letter or encyclical on a controversial issue. Wyatt Goolsby takes a closer look tonight.
They're not as short as a newspaper article, and they're not as long as a novel, but almost every pope since the 18th century has issued an encyclical, which means a circular letter.
I think we have to think of encyclicals as being a letter of a father to his children.
Father Arnie Panula is used to answering questions about papal letters. He heads the Catholic Information Center in Washington, aimed at educating the public on the teachings of the Church.
They're important because often, as I said, that there's confusion among Christians as to how they should respond or think about these issues. And so the Holy Father tries to address them in the Church, to give them, if you want, thinking points or talking points on those.
From morality to the Bible to basic human rights, encyclicals can address almost any issue the Pope chooses. St. John XXIII wrote Peace on Earth in 1963, which warns of the dangers of nuclear weapons. Pope Paul VI wrote Humanae Vitae in 1968, which laid out the Church's teaching against contraception. And St. John Paul II affirmed those teachings and more in the Gospel of Life, which denounced abortion and the death penalty.
To you, too, I address the encyclical on life. May each one of you realize that your own life is a great gift from God.
Encyclicals are not the highest level of church documents, but many of them have proven to be influential decades down the line. Wyatt Goolsby, EWTN News Nightly.
Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. Al-Qaeda suffers the harshest blow to the terror group since the death of Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda now confirms the death of its number 2 leader in a U.S. airstrike in Yemen last week. He was in charge of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, they are considered the terrorists most capable of striking American interests. U.S. intelligence officials have yet to confirm the leader was actually killed in that airstrike. House Speaker John Boehner says he remains committed to passing a major trade deal. House Democrats rejected the president's trade bill last week. Boehner says his team and the White House are looking for a way forward. They haven't found it yet. That bill would give the president fast-track authority on trade deals, which Congress could review and possibly reject. Susanne LaFrankie joins us from the White House. And what did the administration say today about that stalled trade bill, Susanne?
Well, they say they are working feverishly. President Obama's team was back on Capitol Hill today. That, according to Press Secretary Josh Earnest. He said they're up there twisting a few arms of Republicans and Democrats who voted against this trade bill. It is a key piece of the president's legislation, and it is also embarrassing because leading the charge against it was the Democratic House leader Nancy Pelosi. And also, the president was up on the Hill Friday personally lobbying for this bill, which is a very rare event. Josh Earnest says that this trade deal is necessary for the U.S. to compete in a global economy. However, Brian, opponents say that it's anti-union and a jobs killer. The second big subject today here at the White House was on the Pope's encyclical on the environment. And when asked to comment on it, Josh Earnest said that he would not comment on a leaked document, but would rather wait until Thursday when the Vatican officially releases the official document.
That sounds wise. All right, Susanne LaFrankie at the White House, thank you. Search teams return to the woods in northern New York. They're looking for 2 convicted murderers who broke out of a maximum security prison there. More than 800 searchers now shift their focus eastward, looking for David Sweat and Richard Matt. The search is now in its 11th day. Some roadblocks remain in place. State police say they've received more than 1,000 leads, but they say there have been no confirmed sightings of the escapees. Donald Trump makes it official today. He is running for president. The real estate mogul doesn't apologize for being a billionaire.
I don't need anybody's money. It's nice. I don't need anybody's money. I'm using my own money. I'm not using the lobbyists. I'm not using donors. I don't care. I'm really rich. I'll show you that in a second.
Trump is now one of a dozen presidential candidates vying for that GOP nomination. The Donald, as he likes to be called, has tested the waters before, but he has always backed out. A new bill could change Medicaid to possibly help kids with very special needs. As Jason Calvi reports, it has the support of some conservative Republicans as well as liberal Democrats.
Brian, the bill is called the ACE Kids Act of 2015. It would allow for the setting up of regional health care networks for kids with medical complexities. About 40 of those kids were here at the Capitol urging lawmakers to pick up the bill.
2-year-old Audrey is full of life, but she almost didn't make it.
They're doing ultrasounds and stuff, and they tell me her heart is outside her body.
A team of doctors at Texas Children's Hospital saved her. And now Audrey is charming lawmakers. And me, too.
You like this little kitty cat.
She'll need additional surgeries and expert care. That's why her mom and other families are urging Congress to pass the bill. It would make it easier for these children to receive care across state lines.
Medicaid is a state-based program that's funded by states and by the federal government. And so it's kind of like going to one school but needing a class somewhere else. And so to get that class, you actually can't get it sometimes because it exists across state lines.
The Children's Hospital Association says the bill will actually save $13 billion over 10 years. And Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley is the lead sponsor in the Senate.
Some of it's going to depend upon the good job they do of lobbying.
And a cute smile helps when it comes to lobbying.
Anytime that I'm down, anytime I'm sad, anytime that anything feels like, nothing else can go wrong, you look at her and it's amazing.
The bill has bipartisan support. It's right now in committee, but it needs even more support to get it to the floor for debate. Brian?
Jason Calvi on Capitol Hill. Thanks, Jason. Coming up, the church's proactive approach to child protection includes the replacement of bishops. And a white woman who's claimed to be black loses her NAACP leadership position. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy," but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's from today's Gospel, Matthew 5, verses 43 through 48. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday evening, the 16th of June. I'm Brian Patrick. A white woman who self-identifies as African American now speaks openly about her decision. The controversy surrounding Spokane NAACP leader Rachel Dolezal just took another confusing turn.
I identify as black.
In an interview on NBC's Today Show, Dolezal said that she has felt like she was African American from a young age, and despite the criticism she's received, that hasn't changed.
I did feel that at some point I would need to address the complexity of my identity.
Dolezal has been getting international attention after her biological parents, who are both white, told a local newspaper that they can't understand why she is claiming to be African American. After her parents' revelation, many different examples where Ms. Dolezal talked about life as a person of color have been unearthed. Dolezal said she never purposely misled anyone.
Well, I do take exception to that because it's a little more complex than me identifying as black or answering a question of, are you black or white?
Last night, after Dolezal stepped down as president of the Spokane NAACP, members held a solidarity rally. One person says she wants to forgive the former leader, but first, Dolezal needs to admit she did something wrong. Dolezal stopped short of admitting that presenting herself as black was a poor choice.
My life has been one of survival, and the decisions that I have made along the way, including my identification, have been to survive and to, carry forward in my journey and life continuum.
And this reaction tonight from Gloria Purvis of Black Catholics United for Life.
It reminds me so much of what we hear with the trans movement and the justification for people saying, yes, a man can become a woman as long as he had this lifelong internal desire. Who are we to stand in the way of the person realizing their true self? I don't believe any of that. I believe in such a thing as concrete, objective reality, but this is where our society is moving.
Purvis also says both gender and race have biological roots. A federal agency entrusted with millions of employees' records admits to a history of security problems. An official with the Office of Personnel Management testifying today on Capitol Hill, he says for years, many of the people running that agency's information technology had no IT background. He was being questioned about the cyber theft of information on millions of federal workers by hackers linked to China. China denies involvement in the cyber attack. It is being called the most damaging U.S. national security loss in more than a decade. One of Hillary Clinton's closest allies, Sidney Blumenthal, testifies before the committee investigating the deadly 2012 attack in Benghazi, Libya. The committee now has dozens of emails about Libya from Blumenthal to Clinton when she was Secretary of State. The chairman of that House panel says the committee should have received those emails long ago. Pope Francis says it is unfair to label priests who show concern for the poor as communists.
La povertà cristiana è che io do del mio e non del superfluo.
At Mass today, the Holy Father is saying Christian poverty means giving what belongs to us, not the leftovers. Francis says poverty is at the very center of the gospel. If we remove it, he says, no one would be able to understand the message of Jesus. And the Pope accepts the resignation of St. Paul, Minneapolis Archbishop John Nienstedt and his auxiliary bishop. The Archdiocese there accused of failing to protect children from clergy sex abuse. Monsignor Stephen Rossetti is professor of pastoral studies at Catholic University of America. He wrote the paper Learning from Our Mistakes, responding to, effectively to child sexual abusers. Monsignor, what happens to Archbishop Nienstedt now?
Well, Brian, we don't know yet, but probably he'll go into a kind of quasi-retirement mode. He's 68. He'll probably do some, be a low-key, do some priestly duties, but not a large public presence.
This is the second such resignation recently.
This Bishop Finn.
We have not seen this before, have we?
No, in the old days, when a bishop was guilty of some sort of malfeasance, he just sort of kept on. And he was expected to stay in place. He was considered to be the spiritual father of the family, and the father never leaves the family. So that model, which is very important, of course, but the result is that when there's a real problem, they didn't leave when they needed to. And I think we're seeing a sea change, that the Vatican is being much more supportive of bishops who have major problems and cannot lead anymore. They need to step down.
Well, recently some new processes were put into place to address bishops that may have not addressed sexual abuse in or protected children, I guess I should say. Right. Is that possibly convincing some of these leaders to say, I don't think I want to go there?
Well, that's a very striking change by the Holy See, to have an actual arm of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which, by the way, in the centuries ago was called the Inquisition. I mean, you did not want to show up in front of the CDF. So it's a bit of a serious thing. I mean, I think if I were a bishop and I had some problems, I would rather resign than face the CDF.
The bottom line, though, is the protection of children. And what protocols does the church have in place to proactively do that?
Well, in fairness, Brian, I mean, there are some glaring errors from time to time. But if you step back and look what the Catholic Church has done in this country, there's a lot to commend it. You know, last year in the United States, $43 million was spent by the Catholic Church just on child education and prevention, not legal things, child prevention and education. 5 million Americans have gone through this child safe protection program. So we have an enviable record in terms of raising consciousness. And in fact, the child abuse rate has plummeted. And so good things are happening, but we still need to be vigilant.
Monsignor Stephen Rossetti, Catholic University of America, thanks for coming back.
Thanks, Brian.
Up next, they're not homeless, but the working poor need help feeding their families. And yet another Stanley Cup for the Chicago Blackhawks. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord raises up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the just. The Lord protects strangers. From today's responsorial psalm. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday evening, June 16th. I'm Brian Patrick. Congressional Democrats and one independent call for the reform of immigrant family detention centers. In separate letters to the Department of Homeland Security, members of the House and Senate say we need to stop detaining entire families. Nearly 1,500 religious leaders have also signed a letter to President Obama. They're calling for the administration to find ways to give children freedom and dignity while awaiting hearings. Joining us now is Kevin Appleby, Director of the Office of Migration Policy and Public Affairs with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Also Dan Stein, President of the Federation for American Immigration, also known as FAIR. Kevin, the bishops want these detention centers closed. Where will these people go?
Well, first of all, let's talk about who these people are. They're young mothers with children who are very vulnerable. They're fleeing horrific violence in their home countries. Many of them have valid asylum claims. And above all, they're no threat to the community. They're no national security threat. The bishops have been to these detention centers, have talked with these women and these young children, and they have found out that they really need protection. They're the ones running from terror, and we detain them and
they being protected
further
in those
traumatize
detention
them.
Centers?
I'm sorry?
Are they being protected in these centers?
Well, the care that they're given is fine, but studies have shown that psychologically it impairs children over time. And there's been court cases that have said that children should not be detained, that there should be alternatives to detention, which should be provided to these vulnerable populations.
So, Dan, what do you think might be a viable alternative to those seeking asylum?
Well, these are tough issues, but in the end, the role of the government in this case has to be to ensure that people show up for their hearings. And when people were coming across the border and essentially taking advantage of the Obama administration's lax enforcement policies, in a sense, the administration created the incentives for people to try to gimmick and game the system. In order to try to both stop that and ensure people show up for their hearings, they come up with these detention centers, which importantly, they do protect those people who say they're fleeing some form of persecution from harm because they're in those centers. Those centers are, by the way, very elaborate. They're not maximum security prisons. People are quite comfortable there. And the bottom line here is people aren't showing up for their hearings. And if people don't show up for their hearings, the system collapses and breaks down because it means more people will try to come in if they know there's no real effective departure control. People are not sent back. And we have something akin to chaos and anarchy in our immigration control system. So the administration is doing in-country processing. So actually they're screening people for potential asylum claims, refugee claims in the home country. Part of that is designed to prevent a recurrence of people flooding across the land border and as an embarrassment to the administration. But in the end, the issue is, are we both protecting people who need protection, but also ensuring integrity of the system? And we would say, well, we got a lot of work to do, but basically, yes.
Kevin, is there a way to balance humane treatment with this idea of security and making sure that the people do get to their hearings?
Yes. There are programs called alternatives to detention, where the Catholic Church in the past has accepted families like this, placed them in the community, give them case management services, help them find attorneys. And we found that in these programs, 95 to 100% show up for their hearings and they're not detained. So we urge the government to look at these alternatives that are effective and they're also humane, and it also ensures that no one's a threat, that national security is maintained as well. But these are more effective, especially for this vulnerable population. They're indeed refugees. They're fleeing terror.
Dan, do you think that would work?
Well, I don't think we can adjudicate their claims in advance by saying they're all refugees. The whole point of the system is to figure out who has a specific case that would enable them to jump the line in front of millions of people to come in, and who is just trying to take advantage of loopholes in the system. And that's the great challenge, because the longer someone's allowed to stay here illegally, if you will, waiting for their hearing, the greater the likelihood is they'll never go home. And that's one of the fundamental problems with immigration policy. We have in life tough decisions, moral and difficult choices, but in the end, some folks have to go back home. And everybody who's in those detention centers does have the option of signing what they call voluntary departure. They can go back home if they feel it's safe to do so. So it's not like they're in prison. The point is they're being held in a civil process until they can have their hearings. And the only reason they're being detained is because the administration doesn't feel they're going to show up.
Well, I think a lot of people agree that reform is necessary. What we don't agree on a lot of times is how that should be done. We thank both of you for being with us. Dan Stein and Kevin Appleby, thank you both for joining us. And Pope Francis said recently, we must do what we can so that everyone has something to eat. A man here in D.C. answers that call to serve, and Mark Irons has his story tonight.
In the capital of the richest country on earth, people still go to bed hungry. In southeast D.C., a sign on the door of the St. Thomas More food pantry used to say,
"Come back next week, no food."
But now, with the help of Brian Mulholland, this pantry is open 4 days a week. Volunteer Mac Kennedy says Mulholland was sent here by God.
There would not be a tenth of what you see here. Without Brian, what you see here wouldn't exist.
Brian started the John S. Mulholland Family Foundation in honor of his late father, after much thought and prayer.
Thanks in large part to Brian's foundation, this pantry is staying stocked and people are being fed.
100% volunteer run, the foundation supplies food to 3 pantries in the D.C. area.
We do this work because we're called to do it. On Judgment Day, the Lord's going to put us on the left or the right, and those who have helped the least of his brothers will be admitted, and those who haven't won't.
Hey, how you doing?
Many of those who come here are the working poor.
They make a choice between eating or living, and paying their rent or electricity or medical costs.
Thank you. Bag. Get a very low income a month, so this is great for me.
Thank you so much.
In Washington, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Mark. Well, the Chicago Blackhawks snagged the NHL Stanley Cup for the 3rd time in just 6 years. The Hawks shut out the Tampa Bay Lightning 2-0 to win the series in 6 games last night. That game was scoreless until the end of the second period. Next up for the Blackhawks, a parade and rally in the Windy City where they love their Blackhawks. I know our Susie Pinto is a Blackhawks fan. Congratulations. Until tomorrow, like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. Watch again anytime you like on EWTN's YouTube page. For our EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you so much for being with us. Good night and God bless you.